At 2:13 in the morning, the emergency department at Harbor Point Medical Center still carried the layered smell of antiseptic, stale coffee, and ocean salt brought in on the boots of paramedics coming off the harbor road. In Trauma Bay 3, a man whose bearing suggested command, even while unconscious, was losing his pulse as three doctors argued over what kind of collapse they were actually seeing. The monitors washed the room in pale green light. A resident reached for one medication, another insisted on imaging that would come too late, and near the foot of the bed, almost obscured by the movement of louder people, Elena Marquez stood in plain navy scrubs with her dark hair pinned back so tightly it looked less like style than discipline made visible. She noticed details the others were skating past. The patient had not come through the doors in full failure. Something had changed after pressure, after extraction, after the sequence no one was reconstructing carefully enough. Her first correction was nearly missed, but the second was not. When she stepped closer and insisted the patient's pattern did not fit the diagnosis being imposed on him, the room shifted just enough for resistance to sharpen. Dr. Victor Hales looked at her with the polished dismissal that had become one of his habits. He was the kind of man who smiled while invalidating people and mistook the softness of his tone for kindness. He reminded her that physicians were working and implied she should remain in place, contained by role, useful only within the narrow borders other people had drawn for her. Yet the man on the bed convulsed once, not violently but enough to make the monitor leap and flatten and leap again, and outside the bay someone called for blood products while inside Elena stayed focused on smaller, more telling signs. She watched the patient's jaw, his fingertips, the mottling at the edge of one shoulder, the pressure mark on his neck where tactical gear had rubbed against skin already under strain. Then she caught sight of a tattoo half hidden beneath the gown collar, obscured by tape and shadow, and something old and unspoken moved behind her eyes. At the door, the paramedic who had brought the patient in finally forced his report into the room with greater clarity, explaining that the man had come from a maritime training lane near Coronado and had suffered a rapid ascent complication after a secondary impact. Only then did Hales truly stop moving. Elena responded with the calm certainty of someone who had already seen the shape of the emergency and knew the room was treating the wrong disaster. Before anyone could ask why the quiet nurse sounded more certain than the attending surgeon, black SUVs rolled under the emergency awning outside, and front desk security straightened without being told. No one in Bay 3 knew that yet. No one knew the name attached to the patient on the gurney had already moved upward through channels far beyond hospital administration. No one knew that within an hour, a whisper would pass through the same room and cut cleaner than any argument. All anyone in Trauma Bay 3 knew was that Elena Marquez, the nurse most doctors barely noticed until they needed a blanket or a line flushed, had just stepped between prestige and panic. The silence around her suddenly carried more force than the voices that had dismissed her. Harbor Point Medical Center sat high enough above the water that on clear mornings its upper floors caught sunrise before much of the city. People liked to say the building therefore felt optimistic even when it was exhausted, but Elena had long ago learned that optimism in institutions often meant hierarchy made attractive by better lighting. She had worked nights for 11 months and 12 days. No one else counted that way, but she did. In the beginning, she had been less a person than a rumor. She was the transfer from North County with the nearly blank resume, the nurse who never lingered after shift to trade gossip, the woman who rarely corrected anyone unless a patient was involved. She wore inexpensive shoes, packed the same modest lunches, and kept her locker with a precision that suggested ritual more than tidiness. She was not old enough to disappear naturally, not young enough to be indulged for it, and not loud enough to attract the sort of attention that often masqueraded as influence in a busy hospital. Because she offered little of herself for casual consumption, people invented stories to fill the gap. Some decided she had burned out elsewhere. Others guessed she had been a military spouse, or that she lacked ambition, or that she was simply one of those competent but forgettable nurses every hospital quietly depends on while pretending not to. Elena let them wonder because she had no use for correcting narratives that did not affect patient care. Dr. Hales, meanwhile, cultivated two versions of himself. On day shifts, he was polished enough for donors, crisp enough for tour, articulate enough for boards and philanthropy dinners. On nights, his edges showed. He called nurses by their last names when administrators were nearby and by clipped first names when they were not. He praised teamwork in public while keeping a private ledger of whose judgment counted and whose existed only to support his own. Residents adored him until they learned that admiration was rent, not ownership. He liked talented people only when their talent reflected light toward him. He did not like Alina. At first, he mistook her quiet for hesitation. Then he noticed that when he asked for supplies, they appeared in his hand before he had finished the sentence. He noticed that when a family member escalated, Alina settled the room without making him look incompetent. He saw delirious patience calm under her voice, saw difficult floors lower their temperature around her presence, and discovered that her competence made him uneasy rather than relieved. People with genuine authority are often comforted by ability in others. People borrowing authority hear the same thing as threat. The humiliations began so subtly that anyone outside the department would have called them misunderstandings. Alina would give an assessment, and Hales would ask another nurse for confirmation, as though the information had not already been offered. He would restate her observations in slightly altered language and collect credit for insight she had provided seconds earlier. He would tell her to remain within scope whenever she raised concerns, even when those concerns later proved accurate. Once in front of a worried patient's wife, he described Alina as very diligent in the same tone a man might use for a careful cashier. Alina answered only that a potassium result had changed, and he might want to review the update. The wife noticed his expression shift before he recovered. Another time, a resident named Priya Cho found Alina in the break room wrapping athletic tape around her own wrist with an economy of motion that suggested years of practice. Priya asked whether she had once played sports. Alina answered that it had been a long time ago, and that should have ended the conversation. Instead, Priya began noticing things. There was an old pale line on Alina's forearm that looked like a healed wound earned under repeated strain. She tied transport straps one-handed with knots sailors would have respected. She paused in hallways not from distraction, but as if automatically mapping exits, corners, and lines of sight. They were only breadcrumbs, but they were the kind that mean something when one knows how to read them. The affection Alina earned from other staff was careful because she never demanded loyalty, yet she inspired it anyway. Marisol from pediatrics said Alina moved like loud noise never surprised her. Theo from respiratory thought she listened to alarms the way musicians listen to rhythm. Janine at the unit desk swore Alina could identify people by the sound of their shoes before they came into view. In Alina's locker sat a faded challenge coin she never displayed, etched with a lantern, and the words no one left in the dark. The back of the metal had been worn smooth by a thumb passing over it too often for sentiment to remain simple. She never brought it out at work because work, for her, was not where that former life belonged. She did not remind anyone that she held certifications beyond the job's requirements. She did not mention where she had trained or under what conditions she had once worked. She never volunteered the fact that in a storm so cold it burned skin, she had once kept 3 men alive under blackout conditions with 1 damaged med kit and a radio that only worked when lifted shoulder-high toward the sea. Those parts of her stayed locked behind the same stillness everyone kept misreading as absence. The social order of Harbor Point was so rehearsed people stopped seeing it. Surgeons entered rooms like verdicts. Residents spoke fast because hesitation looked costly. Nurses kept the place standing by memory, repetition, and instincts no billing department could itemize. Techs noticed what everyone else missed. Clerks overheard what nobody meant to say aloud. Through all of it, Alina kept doing the thing that confused ambitious people most. She refused to perform importance. Hales, by contrast, had entered a season of visible ascent. A board seat was opening, the hospital was competing for a regional trauma partnership, and his name had begun appearing at philanthropy dinners on cardstock thick enough to suggest inevitability. He practiced humility the way some men practice signatures, often and only where it might be seen. He also became more deliberate about controlling narrative. When a patient's family sent cookies for the entire unit after Alina had sat with their mother for 45 minutes during a difficult wait, Hales thanked them personally and told administration he had led a deeply compassionate interdisciplinary response. When one of Alina's escalation notes prevented a dangerous discharge, he called it good support from nursing. Nothing about his language ever allowed her work to sound like leadership or independent judgment. Nothing in his phrasing could be allowed to cast a shadow over his own. The humiliations peaked in tiny moments that were easy to dismiss separately and impossible to ignore together. During rounds, Alina once pointed out that a patient's blood pressure trajectory had shifted in a way not reflected by the latest single reading. Hales checked the chart, saw she was right, and then turned to a resident to remark that this was why trajectories mattered more than snapshots, as if the insight had arrived from nowhere. On another night, an agitated patient from a yacht accident quieted instantly when Alina spoke to him in a measured, unmistakably command-shaped tone. Hales laughed and suggested she had missed her calling in kindergarten. The room chuckled because hierarchy trains laughter like muscle memory. Alina did not react, but Theo saw her thumb press once against the seam of her scrub pocket where the coin sat behind the fabric. Something in him shifted then. It was not fear. It was recognition without understanding. Janine asked Alina later why she always entered through the ambulance bay when the employee lot was closer. Alina had been looking toward the service road that opened to the harbor route. She blinked, came back to the question, and answered that she was exactly there. Janine remembered the answer for the rest of the shift because it had not sounded poetic. It had sounded trained. The call that changed everything came in at 1:47 a.m. It was a training incident with possible blunt trauma and possible pulmonary involvement. One critical patient, one stable, two walking wounded. The medic report was clipped, professional, and urgent in a way that suggested the caller was used to being understood the first time. Alina looked up from a medication reconciliation and moved before the overhead announcement had finished. In the ambulance bay, rotor noise beat somewhere distant over the harbor, and wind pushed cold salt air through the automatic doors each time they opened. The paramedics rolled in the first patient hard and fast. He was male, late 30s, athletic, hair soaked, oxygen mask fogging with shallow breaths. There was bruising at the clavicle, a pressure pattern across the chest, and a mismatch between the visible injuries and the monitor behavior that bothered Alina immediately. He regained consciousness only briefly, just long enough to grip the rail and focus on her face with a sharpness that did not fit the chaos around him before his eyes rolled shut again. The second paramedic entered with a fractured wrist and an expression filled with controlled panic, not for himself, but for the first man. He insisted they needed a chamber consult immediately. Hales heard only the portion of the report that interested him and pivoted toward imaging. The paramedic tried again, emphasizing rapid ascent, impact, and deterioration after extraction, but Hales rejected what he heard as dramatic field anchoring. While he argued, Alina cut away wet fabric. Under the tactical undershirt, she saw old scar tissue, and near the ribs, a small inked trident obscured by skin tone and shadow. It was not decorative. It belonged to a kind of brotherhood. She asked for the patient's name, and the paramedic answered that it was Commander Luke Mercer. Even the residents knew the name, not from celebrity in the ordinary sense, but because men like Mercer sometimes appeared in official photographs, standing 3 places behind someone else, and still carried more quiet consequence than the person in the center. Hales straightened in a way that made it obvious he recognized opportunity. He ordered the room kept tight and speculation controlled. Alina ignored the performance and focused on the timeline. She asked about the interval between ascent and collapse, about confusion before transport, about unilateral weakness. Each answer pushed the pattern further into focus. Hales resisted the implications, insisting they could not launch a specialty response based on fragmented field memory. Alina finally looked directly at him and told him that if he would not trust the field framing, he could at least trust the evidence in front of him. He replied that she was stepping out of lane. Then a resident reached for a next intervention that might have been defensible in a different case and dangerous in this one, and Alina stopped the resident's wrist just long enough to halt the momentum. The firmness of her refusal carried the weight of experience no one in the room had ever granted her. The next 30 seconds became the kind of memory people replay in fragments for years. Alina called for the consult that should already have been in motion, then a second one, and Ayerk did a positioning change with the help of Theo and Marisol before Hales had finished objecting. She read the monitors, the field history, and the patient's body as a single continuous sentence. There was no flourish in it, no drama, only precision under pressure. She had the transport timeline confirmed, the neurological change documented, and high oxygen support maintained. Theo was already moving in step with her. Hales physically moved to block her and ordered her to step back. She did not. Instead, she spoke with almost painful respect, the kind of respect that strips ego instead of feeding it, and made it clear that if this was what it appeared to be, delay would cost the patient brain and heart. There would be time for anger later, after survival. That sentence froze even Hales for a fraction of a second because it did not sound theatrical. It sounded like the language of someone who had learned in harder places that being disliked was cheaper than being late. A hyperbaric physician came onto speaker from another facility. Alina relayed the sequence cleanly. Hales tried to reframe the same facts in a more authoritative cadence, but by then the pattern had become undeniable. Mercer's response to the interventions Alina had pushed for began to shift in the right direction. His rhythm stabilized enough to buy minutes. His oxygenation stopped falling. One pupil that had threatened to widen held steady. The residents stared openly now. The paramedic at the door looked like a man watching a wall turn into a road. Theo asked under his breath who Alina really was, though whether he meant her history or her capacity in that moment even he could not have said. The transport coordination accelerated. Calls started moving faster. The chamber team mobilized. Hales, forced now to act inside the frame Alina had established, began issuing polished orders into a machine she had already redirected. Then Mercer's hand twitched weakly against the rail. Alina leaned in to secure a line, and for one suspended second his eyes opened a fraction and landed directly on her. There was no recognition yet that anyone else could see, only a feeling that something important had almost surfaced before sedation and transfer pulled the moment away. By any honest account, the first crisis should have ended there, with relief entering the room and everyone acknowledging the nurse whose judgment had tilted the night away from catastrophe. But hospitals are human systems, and human systems often protect rank before truth. The moment Mercer left earshot, Hales turned to staff and reframed the room as confusion. He ordered careful documentation, emphasizing that Alina had overridden attending direction in a high-profile case, and implying that any future review should reflect that instability. Marisol objected that Alina had stabilized the patient. Hales answered that this was only one interpretation. Theo laughed once in disbelief, and immediately regretted it when Hales' attention shifted toward him. Hales accused the room of watching a nurse create chaos in a trauma bay, and warned that if the patient deteriorated in transit after deviation from protocol, he would not allow the department to be destroyed because people had become emotional. The word emotional hung there like a stain, because everyone knew what it was meant to do. Alina, who had just scrubbed Mercer's blood from one sleeve, placed the used scissors down with neat alignment and asked only that the full record include the paramedic intake timestamps. Hales snapped that she did not instruct him on review. She answered that she was asking for the complete record. It was the wrong sentence if her goal had been safety, and exactly the right sentence if her goal had been truth. Before dawn, he filed the complaint. The formal write-up used the sterile language institutions rely on when they want retaliation to sound responsible. Boundary concerns, scope breach, disruption of command structure, potential liability exposure, public confidence risk in VIP care pathways. Alina sat in a tiny administrative office beneath humming fluorescent lights while Monica Bell from nursing operations tried to look regretful across the desk. Monica explained that the case was sensitive, that Commander Mercer was not an ordinary patient, and that Hales had described Alina's actions as interference with physician-led decision-making. Alina answered that the transport medic had requested a chamber consult before transfer had even finished, and that she had acted to protect the patient. Monica insisted on the narrower question, then informed Alina she was being removed from active floor assignment pending incident review. Janine, passing the half-open door, heard enough to understand what had happened. Harbor Point had done what institutions often do when courage appears in the wrong uniform. It had converted the problem into paperwork and hoped the paperwork would win. By 6:20 a.m., rumor had outrun. Fact, some said Alina had panicked. Some said she had played hero because the patient was influential. One resident, embarrassed by what he had witnessed and by how little he had understood in the moment, described Alina to another as having gone rogue. Marisol found Alina in the locker room changing into civilian clothes and called the situation insane. Alina answered only that it was temporary. Marisol insisted it was really Hales making an example of her and told Alina to fight. Alina said she already had. There was no self-pity in the answer, only the exhaustion of someone long familiar with injustice that rarely feels surprise when confronted with itself. Morning came hard and bright over the bay. Glass towers took on gold, sirens thinned into commuter traffic, and Harbor Point turned toward its public day face, the one donors and board members recognized: pressed coats, fresh lobby flowers, smiles that looked professionally ironed. At 8:11, front desk security received a call from the portcatcher and abruptly stopped leaning. 3 black vehicles arrived in a line, not flashy but official enough to quiet a room. Men and women in service dress and dark civilian coats entered with the kind of posture that requires no raised voice to establish consequence. At the center of them was Rear Admiral Daniel Price, commander of the Regional Naval Special Warfare Group, a man few civilians would have known by sight, and whose arrival produced the hospital's chief operating officer in the lobby in under half a minute. Hales, informed moments later, adjusted his tie before adjusting his version of the facts. Elena, by then, was halfway home, stopped at a red light with the radio off and her hands resting at 10 and 2 out of a habit that had never fully left her. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marisol telling her she needed to come back. Another followed immediately and removed all suggestion of choice. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, made a careful U-turn, and headed back. Admiral Price did not arrive breathing fire. That was what unsettled everyone most. He arrived with questions. He wanted to know who had received the patient, who had documented the field report, which attending made the initial differential call when hyperbaric consultation had been requested, who initiated it, why there had been delay between intake and specialist activation, and why the nurse who first flagged the maritime complication was now listed as off-floor pending review. Each question was calm, which made them harder to evade. Monica tried institutional phrasing. Hales leaned on clinical complexity. Residents stared at the floor and hoped not to be asked to choose between truth and career. Theo, once asked directly, decided fear had become useless. He stated plainly that he had seen Nurse Marquez identify the problem before anyone else had taken the field history seriously. Hales interrupted and called that an oversimplification. Price turned to him and asked whether it was inaccurate. For the first time that morning, Hales lacked an immediate answer. Beside the Admiral, Commander Priya Nair, acting as legal liaison, requested monitor logs, room audio timestamps, transport notes, and badge access history. She did not sound accusatory. She sounded prepared, which was worse. The mention of archived trauma bay audio and preserved edits put visible sweat at Hale's temple. Janine saw it from the unit desk and understood, before anyone said so aloud, that deception had finally collided with chain of custody. Elena returned through the side entrance carrying no performance with her, only the same quiet step and clipped badge she always wore. Marisol intercepted her near the elevators and whispered that the Admiral was there. Elena asked whether he was there for Mercer and received the answer that he was there for everything. In the ICU step-down wing, the light was softer, filtered through blinds turned against the glare off the harbor. Commander Luke Mercer lay pale but stable, the hard edge of command temporarily surrendered to medication, tape, and recovery. Even unconscious, he looked like someone accustomed to carrying the room. Admiral Price stood at the foot of the bed with his hands behind him. He turned as Elena approached. For a suspended heartbeat, recognition moved across his face in fragments, not certainty yet but some older memory testing the air. Monica tried to reclaim procedure and object to Elena's presence, but Price lifted a hand and silenced her. Elena approached the bed, checked the monitor, adjusted nothing, and touched two fingers lightly to Mercer's wrist in the manner of a clinician who no longer needed the numbers to confirm what she already saw. Mercer's eyelids twitched. His breathing changed. Then he opened his eyes just enough to see the ceiling, the Admiral, and finally Elena. What crossed his face was not confusion. It was the effortful drag of buried memory, surfacing through medication and pain. He tried to speak. Elena leaned closer and calmed him, telling him with the measured certainty of her old life that he was safe. That was enough. His eyes sharpened. In a voice rough enough to be almost breath, he whispered one word that no one else in the room understood, and the Admiral understood immediately. He called her Lantern. The word meant nothing to Monica, little to Hales, and everything to Daniel Price. His head turned toward Elena, then back to Mercer, then to Elena again, and in that moment the architecture of the entire night reordered itself around a truth Harbor Point had never bothered to imagine. Mercer whispered the word again, stronger this time, as if confirming to himself that he had not invented her through sedation. Elena did not dramatize the recognition. She did not break open or perform surprise. The shift in her was smaller and more profound. Her shoulders eased by a fraction, and the stillness everyone had mistaken for emptiness changed from concealment to acceptance. Price addressed her by rank, calling her Chief Marquez. Monica actually looked around the room in confusion, convinced there must be another person present. Elena answered that she was not chief anymore. The room fell silent in layers, not a nurse overreaching, not a timid transfer. Not an anonymous employee improvising above her station. Chief. Mercer moved his hand weakly across the sheet until Elena set her palm against it just long enough to steady him. His eyes closed again, not from crisis but from release. Then Price turned toward compliance and legal staff and stated for the record that Senior Chief Alina Marquez had once served as lead medical operator on a maritime special response detachment attached to his command, and that her operational call sign had been Lantern. He added that if Mercer had identified her in that condition, then he remembered exactly who had once kept him alive during the Gulf blackout extraction. Hales began to speak about protocol, but Price ended any room for speculation with a level gaze and a sentence stripped of theater. He was not speculating. With that, all the old breadcrumbs began connecting in other people's minds. Theo remembered the wrist scar, the knots, the mapped exits, the command cadence, the coin. Marisol covered her mouth. Janine whispered that she had known, though in truth she had known only that Alina's quietness had structure. Price did not need to say much more. Commander Nair already had what she required to shift the review from interpersonal discomfort to institutional failure. Monica Bell attempted to defend herself by claiming she had never been informed of Alina's background. Alina told her she had been informed that there was prior federal medical service and that the details had been redacted. Monica remembered then the hiring note she had skimmed because the incomplete resume had felt administratively inconvenient. Hales clung to the only defense he thought remained and argued that background did not determine present protocol, that if Alina had violated procedure, then there was still a problem. Nair answered before Alina did, remarking that the real issue might be whether procedure had failed the patient or the patient had been failed by the people applying it. She requested a conference room. The fourth-floor conference room overlooked the harbor, which usually gave tense meetings the illusion of calm. That morning it only made the hospital feel exposed. Sunlight lay in bright rectangles across the table. Beyond the glass, water flashed blue. Inside, careers began tightening around Truth. Present were Admiral Price, Commander Nair, Harbor Point's Chief Medical Officer Russell Fenwick, Monica Bell, Dr. Hales, 2 risk officers, Theo as witness, the transport paramedic petty officer Mason Velez, and Alina, seated halfway down the table with her hands loosely folded as if she were present for someone else's review. The audio from Trauma Bay 3 was imperfect, but the timeline was not. At 1:52 a.m., the intake note had referenced a rapid ascent complication. At 1:54, Alina had asked about interval to collapse. At 1:55, she had requested specialty consultation. At 1:56, the attending had disputed field framing. At 1:58, patient deterioration had escalated. At 1:59, the consultation request had been confirmed. At 2:01, an attending note draft, later edited, had begun positioning the decision as physician-led. Nair paused there and asked when the edits had been made. A risk officer admitted that some had been finalized after transfer. Nair repeated the phrase after transfer with enough precision to strip it of innocence. Hales argued that active trauma documentation is often finalized later. Nair agreed that clarification is normal, but reassignment of sequence is not. Mason Velez then gave his statement. He confirmed that Alina had been the only clinician in the room to immediately ask the questions that mattered, and the only one who had responded the field report as though it contained urgent information rather than background noise. Confirmed that she had prevented a wrong-direction bedside intervention. Marisol, called in afterward, confirmed that Hales had characterized Alina's actions as chaos once Mercer was gone. Janine confirmed that Alina had been removed from duty within hours. Then Nair asked Alina a question no one else had asked with real sincerity. She wanted to know why Alina had not disclosed her operational background when it became clear the room was moving toward the wrong decision. Alina took a moment before answering. The patient had not needed her history. The patient had needed the right call. The answer was so clean it embarrassed everyone whose motives were not. Hales attempted one final pivot, insisting that hospitals cannot run on nurses improvising based on undocumented military experience. Price, who had been watching the harbor for part of the proceedings, turned back and said that Hales kept using the word improvising. Then he explained, with the weight of 19 years of knowing Mercer and reading after-action reports, that Alina had operated in environments with no backup, no extra oxygen, no imaging, and no room for ego. She had not improvised in Trauma Bay 3. She had recognized a pattern faster than the hospital's hierarchy allowed. Fenwick, who had hoped the matter might resolve quietly, finally accepted that quiet was no longer available. He asked Hales directly whether he had filed a disciplinary action before reviewing complete documentation. Hales called it a provisional concern, but Fenwick pressed until he answered yes. Then Fenwick asked whether Hales had modified his note after consultation was activated. Hales described it as clarifying sequence, but again the answer was yes. No one moved. Alina watched him without triumph. That absence of gloating seemed to unsettle him more than accusation might have. People who live by conflict often do not know what to do with dignity. Nair then closed the folder in front of her and said that for the purposes of her review, the matter was now clear. Commander Mercer had received timely life-saving recognition because Nurse Marquez had acted despite resistance, and retaliatory action had followed. Those two words, retaliatory action, translated moral failure into legal weight. The room changed again. Vindication did not arrive with thunder. It arrived the way such things often do in institutions, through administrative language, timestamps, and the slow collapse of a false story under the weight of its own edits. Hales was placed on immediate clinical review before lunch. No one staged a theatrical removal. Harbor Point was too polished for spectacle. Instead, he was escorted into a private office with Fenwick and legal counsel while afternoon cases were reassigned. Residents saw doors close. Nurses watched calendars scramble. By sunset, everyone knew enough. Monica withdrew the pending disciplinary flag from Alina's personnel file and issued an internal correction to her status. At first, she tried to explain the matter through communication gaps. Alina stopped her with a quiet refusal and said there had been assumptions, not confusion. That sentence stayed with Monica longer than any formal reprimand. The hospital announced a policy review into escalation pathways for nursing concerns in emergent care. Risk management, suddenly eager to sound principled, began speaking about interdisciplinary respect. Staff on the floor understood the truth more clearly. Policy had not suddenly discovered virtue. Policy had discovered exposure. Still, consequences matter even when motives arrive late. The story spread through Harbor Point in fractured versions. The quiet nurse was former Special Operations Medical. A naval commander had recognized her by call sign. The star attending had tried to bury her. The admiral himself had intervened. Beneath every retelling lay a simpler truth. A woman had done her job with extraordinary competence, and others had belittled her because they mistook performance for value. Mercer improved over the next day with the kind of recovery that made even pain seem orderly. Alina did not hover. She returned to work because the schedule resumed and because patients continued arriving regardless of revelation. Yet the hallways felt different now. Orderlies stepped aside with awkward respect. Residents looked at her, then away, ashamed by recollections of their own dismissive smiles. A surgeon from another unit, someone who had never previously bothered to learn her first name, nodded and called her chief before catching himself. Alina told him Alina was fine. Marisol later asked whether she wanted people corrected more forcefully. Alina said no because fear is not respect. That answer spread too. Late one afternoon, she entered Mercer's room with medication and a chart update. The blinds were open and harbor light lay silver across the bed. He was alert enough now to hold a full gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he told her he had known it was her from her voice, though he had been too medicated to reach the memory at first. Alina replied that he was remembering too much too soon and needed rest. He studied her and noted that she still did the same thing she used to do, save the room first and speak later. Memory crossed his face. Rain, darkness, rotor wash, a younger self coughing seawater into mud while a woman in blackout gear checked his pulse and made a hard choice fast. He said the admiral claimed she had disappeared after Manila. Alina corrected that she had retired. He answered that vanishing and retiring had looked much the same from the outside. Then he said what had been gnawing at him since waking. He had heard enough to understand that people at Harbor Point had mocked her. Alina did not grant the word directly. She said only that they had not known her. Mercer replied, with the contained anger of a man whose anger usually waits to become useful, that ignorance and mockery are not the same thing. 3 days later, Harbor Point held a formal staff review in the auditorium usually reserved for education sessions and grant announcements. Nobody called it a reckoning, but everyone felt one approaching. The room held nurses, physicians, techs, administrators, residents, compliance staff, and enough tension to distort sound. Fenwick opened with institutional language about standards, collaboration, and lessons learned. Then, to his credit, he did one honest thing. He named what had happened. A nurse's clinically sound escalation had been dismissed, he said, and that dismissal had been followed by retaliatory action inconsistent with the values of the hospital. It was not perfect language, but it was public. Hales was not present. He had resigned pending review the evening before, a phrase that preserved the hospital's image while ending his future there. Monica Bell stood next and apologized more directly than Alina expected. The apology was not graceful, but it was sincere enough to cost Monica something. She admitted she had confused hierarchy with safety and promised not to make that mistake again. Theo sat in the third row with his arms crossed. Janine stared at the stage as if she wanted the sentence engraved. Then Fenwick did something smarter than offering more speeches. He asked Alina to come forward. Lena clearly had not requested the moment. She walked to the stage with the reluctant composure of someone who would have preferred another 12-hour shift to public attention. Under the flat wash of auditorium lights, her eyes remained steady. Fenwick turned toward her and apologized formally on behalf of Harbor Point Medical Center. He told her that her judgment had saved a patient and that her professionalism under pressure had protected the institution from a failure in its own culture. He said the hospital was grateful. The word was too small, but it was the one he had. Alina stepped to the microphone because silence required response. She accepted the apology and nothing more. No speech, no performance of magnanimity. That alone shifted the room. Then the back doors opened and Commander Luke Mercer entered in civilian clothes, still recovering, one arm constrained and the last traces of hospital pallor still on his face. Admiral Price walked beside him. Neither had warned the hospital they intended to appear. Mercer came to the front without fanfare and spoke clearly enough for the entire room to hear. He said that the nurse they had judged had saved his life before most of them knew a real decision existed. He told them she had done the same in other places where nobody applauded and nobody got names right. He stated, as the patient in question, that Harbor Point had not nearly lost him because Alina Marquez stepped out of line. Harbor Point had nearly lost him because too many people needed her to remain inside a line they had drawn for comfort. Then he explained that she had been called Lantern for a reason, because in dark rooms she saw what others missed. Finally, he looked at her, and with gentleness the microphone carried to everyone present said it was good to see her again. The aftermath revealed another human truth. Once withheld, respect often rushes in too quickly and shows itself as guilt wearing better clothes. Over the following week, Alina received more smiles than she had in the previous 11 months combined. A cafeteria worker refused to charge her for coffee. A resident asked whether she would review a trauma simulation with him. Administrators began using phrases like leadership opportunity as if bouquets of opportunity might cover the smell of prior behavior. Alina accepted none of it blindly. When Fenwick offered her a role in emergency training and rapid response education, she did not answer immediately. She asked what changes would actually be protected when memory faded, protected from budge. TS from ego, from becoming optional once institutional embarrassment cooled. Fenwick took too long to answer. Still, some changes on the floor were real because ordinary people made them real. Theo started insisting that junior staff be heard all the way through before any call was dismissed. Marisol inserted a standing question into intake drills, asking who had seen something nobody else had addressed. Janine, in her own quiet domain, began noting patterns in whose concerns got buried and whose did not. This was how institutions changed honestly, not by one speech, but by many people refusing to keep the old lie alive. Mercer visited her once more before full discharge. It was late in the evening, the hospital quieter, the windows reflecting as much interior light as they admitted from outside. He found Alina in the family consult room explaining to an exhausted husband that his wife's post-operative confusion would likely improve by morning. When she finished and stepped into the hall, Mercer stood there with Admiral Price several paces behind. Alina asked whether he was walking too far already. Mercer replied that she was still issuing orders. She answered that they were suggestions. Price looked between them with the unmistakable expression of a man relieved to see survivors in the same frame and stepped back to give them a minute. Mercer mentioned the training role he had heard the hospital offered her. Alina replied that it was not command. He observed that she still had a habit of shrinking the noun. Then he reached into his jacket and held out the challenge coin she had once thought lost years before during an operation no one outside their world could have named. Lantern was etched on one side and no one left in the dark on the other. Alina stared at it. Mercer explained that she had dropped it in the extraction bird after shoving him into a seat and going back for Mason Velez. Velez had kept it all these years, believing it belonged with the person who had earned it. Alina took the coin as though it weighed much more than metal. For the first time since the long night began, feeling showed plainly on her face. Not tears, not collapse, only the visible ache of receiving back a piece of herself she had buried beneath practical reasons and old grief. Mercer saw the shift and, out of courtesy, looked away. Then he told her that half his team had once thought Lantern was just a story told to frighten operators into listening to medics. Alina answered that perhaps they had been right. The final collapse of Hale's narrative happened without Alina present, which was perhaps the greatest mercy. She did not need to watch a man dismantle himself under documentation, but word reached her the way hospital news always does, stripped of polish by repetition. He had tried to frame his note edits as standard reconciliation. The audio undermined him. He had insisted he had never mocked Alina's judgment. Witness statements undermined him. He had portrayed the disciplinary action as temporary risk management. Timing undermined him. In the end, no single dramatic lie ruined him. It was a pattern, small subtractions, strategic omissions, the habit of shaving other people down so his own authority looked taller by comparison. Boards and review panels are sometimes slow to punish arrogance. They are quicker to punish altered sequence and retaliatory documentation. Hales resigned before the final hearing concluded. Some people called that escaping consequence. Alina did not. She said there are men who live inside the story they tell about themselves, and that losing the story is consequence. When Marisol asked how she could say something like that after everything, Alina answered that rage is expensive, and she would rather spend energy on the living. The sentence moved through the hospital, changed shape as it traveled, and soon appeared on a sticky note beside a workstation until Janine took it down before compliance found it. 6 weeks later, Harbor Point's new training cycle began. In Simulation Room 2, under kinder fluorescence, and beside equipment newer than the staff fully trusted, Alina stood before a mixed group of nurses, residents, techs, and one skeptical surgical fellow who had not yet learned the danger of underestimating plain clothing. She had accepted the training role on one condition: the drills would be cross-discipline, and the first rule would be that the best observation wins, no matter who says it. She built the sessions around recognition under pressure, timing, humility, and the cost of dismissing people for reasons unrelated to accuracy. She did not tell military stories. She did not lead with title. Fenwick tried once to introduce her by former rank, and she stopped him. That day, she told the room, she was their instructor, and that was enough. In one simulation, a junior nurse identified a subtle deterioration before a senior resident did. The room hesitated, old culture reaching for old Ray. Flex, Alina let the silence stretch. Then she asked who had the best read. The resident answered that the nurse did. It was a small correction, but it mattered. That was how new reflexes were born where old ones used to live. Months later, on a cool evening with fog beginning to gather over the water, Harbor Point held a modest staff excellence ceremony in the atrium. It was the kind of event people usually attended from obligation and left from boredom. Folded chairs, sheet cake, pastries no one really wanted. A sound system slightly too loud. Alina almost did not go until Janine told her she had refused every other form of attention and could survive one evening of mediocre dessert. So Alina stood near the back in a clean black dress and low heels she clearly regretted, trying to look like a woman who might at any moment need to resuscitate someone rather than receive applause. When her name was called for clinical leadership and patient advocacy, the applause began politely and then changed into something slower and heavier. It was not celebrity. It was respect, the earned kind that arrives later than ego and lasts longer. Lena crossed the stage, accepted the plaque, and was preparing to step down when a familiar voice from the side aisle told the room to wait. Mercer was there, fully recovered now, jacket on, color restored, one hand in his pocket like a man trying not to make a scene while entirely making one. Soft laughter rippled through the room. He took the spare microphone and remarked that he had been told the event was about leadership, which seemed incomplete. Turning to Alina, he said that most people think courage looks loud, but in his experience, the best kind usually speaks in complete sentences and wastes no time explaining itself. Then he held up the challenge coin and said some of them had known her by another name long before Harbor Point ever had. He lowered his voice until the room leaned in and then spoke her call sign once more. He did not need to raise it. Whispering Lantern was enough. In that whisper lived awe, dignity, and the final collapse of every shallow judgment that had preceded it. Afterward, there was no swelling music and no polished cinematic speech, only human aftermath. Theo hugged Alina too hard and pretended he had not. Marisol cried and blamed her makeup. Janine confiscated the plaque before Alina could abandon it on a chair. Fenwick thanked her for staying. Monica Bell shook Alina's hand with both of hers and admitted she was still learning from what she had gotten wrong. Alina answered that she was still learning too. When the crowd thinned and the harbor beyond the atrium became only scattered lights blurred by fog, Elena stood alone for a moment at the windows with the coin in one hand and the plaque awkward under the other arm. The glass reflected her back at herself, not as legend, not as the invisible nurse people had once preferred, but simply as a woman shaped by service, loss, discipline, and a long refusal to let contempt determine her size. Mercer joined her and asked whether she intended to keep the plaque. She said she was considering donating it to Janine, who seemed more invested. He smiled. The silence between them no longer carried burden, only history. Then he told her why the name Lantern had truly stayed. It had not been because of the mission report. It had endured because when everyone else began seeing darkness, Elena had always started looking for people. That was the deepest truth of her, deeper than rank, deeper than skill, deeper even than bravery. Some compliments praise what a person can do, some praise what a person can endure. Rarely one reveals to someone who they have always been. This one did. The moral of her story was not simply that hidden talent exists. Everyone already knows that. The deeper truth was that prejudice often wears a professional face. It speaks politely. It uses titles correctly. It confuses confidence with competence and quiet with limitation. It humiliates people in small ways first, then acts shocked when those small ways are finally named for what they are. Elena never needed revenge to become extraordinary because she already was. What she needed, what too many good people need, was one moment when truth became too visible for power to edit. That moment had come in a hospital room washed in monitor light and seawater and fear, when a commander waking from the edge of disaster looked through the false story others had wrapped around her and spoke the name of the woman they had failed to recognize. Lantern. A light not asking to be admired. A light simply doing its job. Harbor Point continued changing after Elena, though not perfectly. No place ever does. New hires learned the story in fragments. Simulation drills became more honest. Escalation grew slightly less political. Older staff quietly retired habits they would never confess to having held. On difficult shifts, when a room turned noisy and some body needed to cut through confusion with clean judgment, junior nurses sometimes heard Theo mutter that the best observation wins and answered faster than they would have a year earlier. Elena kept her night shifts more often than not because she preferred the honesty of them. The city beyond the glass softened after midnight. Titles mattered less at 3 in the morning. Fear became more human. Gratitude became simpler. During those hours, she moved through the halls with the same calm stride, the same disciplined economy, the same habit of noticing what others missed. The difference now was that when new residents mistook her quiet for uncertainty, older staff did not interfere too soon. They let the lesson arrive naturally. Sometimes a room needs to learn. Sometimes it needs to change. Sometimes all it takes is one person with nothing to prove and everything to protect. That was Elena Marquez. That was Lantern. And this was the night a hospital judged her by appearance, until the truth forced everyone inside it to look again.